an intersection, a protester suddenly ran into the middle of the street and in front of the oncoming tanks. The tanks stopped, and the lead tank tried moving to one side and then to the other side to avoid hitting him, but the protester kept running in the same pattern as
a tremendous outpouring of anger at Li Peng, Deng Xiaoping, the entire Chinese government. It had the real feeling of rebellion in the streets of Beijing.
We have heard through several sources tonight, including sources from various embassies, that the 20th and 40th divisions were set to fight it out somewhere in the area of Jiangguo-Menwai. That is the diplomatic compound area.
China appears to be on the brink of civil war.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
China is awash in rumors. Rumors, mind you, but some of them may even be true. A rumor that Li Peng, the premier, was shot in the leg by a rebellious soldier. A rumor that party chairman Deng Xiaoping is dead. Both of those rumors may have more basis in the wishful thinking of angry demonstrators than in any reality, but it's also a natural outgrowth of a weekend during which the unthinkable and the unimaginable occurred with numbing regularity. We are awaiting a late satellite transmission from Hong Kong with the most recent videotapes from Beijing and Shanghai. We are in telephone contact with several of our correspondents in China, and we'll talk to them about increasing reports of fighting among Chinese army units. You will hear and see examples of incredible heroism, some poignantly simple, as when a staffer of the Chinese embassy here in Washington today responded to demonstrators in the streets below by tying a pair of curtains into the V for Victory symbol. During the course of this day, we have been debriefing our colleagues in China over the phone, matching pictures where we can, creating a montage of this day. We begin with Nightline producer Kyle Gibson.
Dawn broke this morning after a long, loud night of tanks rolling by our window at Beijing Hotel. It was really a night of no sleep at all. The tanks were continuous. They were rolling from east to west, just piling in one after another into Tianenmen Square. The military was clearly out to reinforce their position. We looked out our windows at about 8:30, expecting perhaps to see rush hour, not knowing really what we would see, and certainly there was no rush hour. In fact, I'd say about 90% of the people who should have been on the street on a normal Monday morning were not there. But it became clear that there were really three reasons why the people weren't out going to work. There were people who were merely too afraid to get to work. There were those who couldn't get any transportation to work. And then, of course, there were those who were striking, and we all knew that there was a strike scheduled for today after the violence of the weekend.
10 o'clock Monday morning, I went out on the streets in the northern part of the city, and at first everything seemed quiet until I'd run a few blocks, and then I started seeing burnt-out buses and military trucks that had been overturned. There were thousands of people out on the street, but very little traffic. There were people riding bicycles, looking at the rubble, at the destruction. And in the heart of the city, a lot of people were lining up at shops to try and buy provisions, but most of the shops in the city were shut down.
We then proceeded to the hospital, a nearby hospital, and found that a hospital with a capacity for 60 patients was holding more than 200 today on Monday morning. We were in fact able to see down one hallway where there were mattresses on the floor and at least 25 patients, obviously people wounded in Tiananmen Square, lined up on these mattresses on the floor in the hallway. I would not call it a scene of chaos. I would call it, by Monday morning, it looked to me more like a scene of enormous fatigue and depression on the part of the hospital workers.
Shortly before noon Monday, Beijing time, a column of tanks moved out of the square and they began heading east in the direction of the Beijing Hotel. At an intersection, a protester suddenly ran into the middle of the street and in front of the oncoming tanks. The tank stopped, and the lead tank tried moving to one side and then to the other side to avoid hitting him, but the protester kept running in the same pattern that the tank was moving. Finally, the lead tank, the rest of the convoy naturally stopped. And when the convoy finally did stop moving, the protester suddenly climbed on top of the tank. He stayed there for about 15 to 30 seconds. When I saw that moment, I knew what it meant when the protesters had said they were willing to die for their cause. Because what he did was such a remarkable and bold and brazen act of defiance. After that 15 to 30 seconds, he climbed down off the tank. At that point, these protesters, these other protesters who were watching this incredible scene from the sides of the road, they rushed onto the center of the street and pulled this fellow away, out of harm's way.
This afternoon, about 2 or 3 o'clock, I went out again and went further north, where there had been a barricade earlier. And by the time I got there, there were many trucks and buses barricading what's virtually a 4-lane highway. And across the buses, people had put out posters saying, "Hang Li Peng, the premier." And they were yelling, there were speeches going on. People were listening to each other, talking. They were trying to rally up some support for armed resistance. One young man who was a student said, "The people want arms. The people want weapons. They want to fight the military out of their city."
Are you angry?
Oh, of course. I can't imagine what happened. Till now, I feel I have a dream. I have a dream. I can't understand why some life just vanished a few paces from me. I can't imagine. I sometimes just can't believe my eye. Believe. Perhaps unless I got a bullet, I can't believe it.
I really feel angry, really, about this, incredible violence.
声援我们中国人民吧，
真的。
声援我们，一定要声援我们。
And I can hardly find any words to speak.
不是你说这国家部队枪口直接对着好了，这么大小孩都死了，这么大小孩都死了，有这么残忍不的人闹的没有？
We think that we should live peacefully. We don't want the army. We don't want gunshots and the fire. Army firing at the innocent people.
The 27th Army, which is loyal to Yang Shangkun, China's president, and controlled by his relatives, is the army that has been doing all the dirty work, all the bloodletting in the center of the city, and they are hated by everyone. The 38th Army, another army from the region, is seen as much more sympathetic to the people, and they're also said to have no ammunition at all. A lot of those troops have abandoned their trucks in the center of the city. Some of them have even burned their own trucks and basically joined the side of the people in this rebellion.
At about 2 o'clock, we saw an astonishing convoy heading from east to west into Tianenmen Square. What this convoy included were 75 troop carriers, 75 vehicles with troops inside, and each vehicle contained 25 troops. We saw trucks carrying supplies like portable kitchens, portable bathrooms, trucks carrying water tanks. We saw radio trucks used for communications. It was clear that this procession, including 75 troop carriers, was providing Tiananmen Square with supplies which would allow the military to dig in for a very, very long time. By Monday evening, we started seeing more smoke in many directions of the city. We could see smoke from fire on the eastern edge of Chang'an Boulevard, down east from the hotel. We could see smoke from fire in the south. We could hear gunfire in the south, and there was smoke in the west. We saw tear gas. At that point, things grew more and more ominous. It just felt increasingly dangerous to be where we were located. For the first time Monday evening, as the tanks rolled towards us down Chang'an Boulevard from Tiananmen Square, there were troops on those tanks ready to fire at any time. Our bureau chief decided at that point that we should leave the hotel, that things were becoming increasingly dangerous, increasingly ominous. We then packed up as quickly as we possibly could, and he arranged through the walkie-talkie to have cars meet us out back, and the cars whisked us away to the Palace Hotel, really just a few blocks away, but it seems continents safer than where we had been, just overlooking Tianenmen Square. At 1:09, all the lights went out in the west of the city. It went almost pitch black, just very few lights left in the city. We have heard through several sources tonight, including sources from various embassies, that the 20th and 40th divisions were set to fight it out somewhere in the area of Jiangguo-Menwai. That is the diplomatic compound area, east of the Beijing Hotel, east of Tiananmen Square. At the moment, it's 2 in the morning, Tuesday morning. I feel exhausted and I feel quite fearful, knowing that somewhere nearby there is a civil war that's about to begin. We don't know quite where or when. In some ways, I felt more secure in the Beijing Hotel, where we could see right down below where the worst part of the fighting was. It was very defined. Now it's much less defined, and just who is fighting who is less defined, and where it's going to happen in the dark of night is clearly undefined.
We expect to have some late video from China later in this broadcast, but next, when we come back, we'll talk with some of our people on the scene in Beijing and with experts on China, both here and overseas.
This is